A routine ER visit turns into a battle for justice when a dismissive doctor ignores a black woman's pain, unaware her family has the power to hold him accountable. What happens next will leave you speechless. Subscribe and share where you're watching from. It was supposed to be a quick visit to the emergency room, but what happened that evening would leave everyone in the hospital talking for weeks. The small-town ER in Savannah, Georgia was busy but not chaotic. Nurses hustled between rooms, and patients sat quietly in the waiting area. Among them was Aisha Monroe, a 28-year-old teacher, clutching her side in visible pain. She had been dealing with intense abdominal cramps for the past 3 days, and by now, the pain had become unbearable. She looked around the room, her dark brown eyes scanning for a nurse or doctor, but no one seemed to notice her discomfort. Her breathing was shallow, and she winced every few seconds, trying to adjust her position in the stiff plastic chair. Finally, a nurse called her name. Aisha stood slowly, clutching her side, and followed the nurse into a room. After the usual checks, blood pressure, pulse, and a quick rundown of her symptoms, the nurse left, promising the doctor would be in soon. Aisha waited, staring at the fluorescent lights above her. Dr. Stephen Grant walked in, a man in his late 40s with years of experience but an air of impatience. He was tall, with graying hair and an expression that rarely softened. He glanced at Aisha's chart without even acknowledging her directly. "So, abdominal pain?" he asked, his tone flat. "Yes, it's been getting worse. I can barely stand upright," Aisha replied, her voice strained but polite. Dr. Grant barely looked up. "Probably just gas or something minor. You're young. These things happen." Aisha frowned, unsure how to respond. "I don't think it's something small. I know my body, and this doesn't feel normal." Dr. Grant sighed, flipping the pages on her chart. "Look, I'll order some basic blood work and maybe an ultrasound if necessary. But honestly, I wouldn't worry too much. It's probably nothing." Aisha's face tightened, frustration growing. "With respect, I've been in pain for days. I've tried everything. Over-the-counter meds, heating pads, resting. Nothing is helping. I really need you to take this seriously." But Dr. Grant had already made up his mind. To him, Aisha was just another overly anxious patient who had Googled her symptoms and decided they were serious. "I understand," he said curtly, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Let's get the tests done, and we'll go from there." He left the room without another word, leaving Aisha to sit alone, her frustration mixing with the pain she was trying so hard to endure. Hours passed, blood tests were taken, and an ultrasound was finally conducted. Aisha waited patiently for the results, but no one came to update her. She flagged down a nurse who promised to check, but even she didn't return. As the minutes dragged on, Aisha's patience ran out. She walked slowly to the nurse's station where Dr. Grant was reviewing another chart. "Excuse me, doctor. It's been hours. Do you have my results yet?" Dr. Grant looked up, clearly annoyed. "I'll let you know when I do, Miss Monroe. Please return to your room." "Miss Monroe? That's Mrs. Monroe, doctor," came a deep voice from behind her. Aisha turned to see her husband Marcus walking in. He was a tall, confident man in his early 30s with a calm but commanding presence. Dr. Grant barely glanced at him. "Mr. Monroe, I'll let you know as soon as we have updates. We're busy tonight." But Marcus didn't move. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped a few buttons before holding it up. "This is my wife's cousin. Recognize him?" he asked, his tone steady but pointed. Dr. Grant glanced at the screen. His face changed instantly. On the screen was a photo of Senator Jonathan Ellis, a powerful figure in the state, known for his advocacy for healthcare reform. "I'd like to think you wouldn't ignore a patient, but if you need encouragement to take her case seriously, maybe her cousin could provide it," Marcus said. Dr. Grant's mouth opened slightly as if to speak, but no words came out. The shift in his demeanor was immediate, and Aisha noticed it too. She crossed her arms, not out of defiance, but to show she wasn't going to back down. "I'll check her results right now," Dr. Grant stammered before hurrying off. Aisha and Marcus exchanged a glance. Marcus placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "He's going to regret making you wait," he said softly. As they stood together, a nurse walked past and whispered under her breath, "About time someone put him in his place." The tide was turning, and Dr. Grant had no idea how big of a storm was coming his way. Dr. Grant returned to Aisha's room, clutching her chart with both hands. His face had lost its earlier smugness, replaced by what looked like nervous determination. He flipped it through the papers, pretending to review the results again, as if stalling for time. "Well, Mrs. Monroe," he began, his tone noticeably softer. "Your blood work shows some irregularities. The ultrasound revealed some inflammation around your appendix. It's likely appendicitis, but we'll need a CT scan to confirm." Aisha's eyes narrowed. "Appendicitis? You mean the condition you dismissed earlier as just gas? And now you want me to wait longer for another test while my appendix might burst?" Dr. Grant opened his mouth, but no words came out. Marcus stepped in, his voice calm but firm. "Doctor, I hope you realize the seriousness of this. If her condition had worsened because of your negligence, there would be consequences." Grant swallowed hard, nodding quickly. "Of course. Let me expedite the scan and ensure we get this resolved immediately." Minutes later, Aisha was wheeled into the imaging department. The technician worked swiftly, and the scan was completed in record time. Within 20 minutes, Dr. Grant was back in her room, his face pale. "The scan confirms acute appendicitis. You need surgery right away," he said, the weight of the situation evident in his voice. Aisha sighed, her frustration still simmering beneath the surface. "That's what I've been trying to tell you all day. I just needed you to listen." Marcus leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "And now that you've confirmed it, I expect you'll handle this with the urgency it deserves. If not, we'll be making some phone calls." Grant nodded quickly. "The surgical team is already on their way. We'll have her prepped in no time." As Aisha was being prepared for surgery, word of the situation began to spread among the staff. Nurses whispered to one another, clearly enjoying the rare sight of Dr. Grant scrambling to fix his mistake. One nurse, a kind older woman named Linda, approached Aisha's bedside. "Mrs. Monroe, I'm so sorry for how you've been treated tonight," she said softly. "We've all seen it before with him, but you've handled this with so much grace. I'll be with you the entire time during surgery." Aisha smiled faintly, grateful for the support. "Thank you, Linda. I just want this to be over so I can focus on healing." The surgery went smoothly, thanks to the skilled hands of a different surgeon. Aisha woke up in recovery hours later, Marcus sitting beside her, holding her hand. Dr. Grant entered the room cautiously, standing at the foot of her bed. "Mrs. Monroe, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry, I didn't handle your case the way I should have, and I let my assumptions cloud my judgment." Aisha studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded. "Apology accepted, doctor. But let me be clear, what happened tonight isn't just about me. There are others who don't have the connections or the courage to stand up for themselves. I hope you'll think about that the next time you see a patient in pain." Dr. Grant nodded solemnly, his face a mix of regret and understanding. "You're right, I will." Marcus stepped forward, his tone still firm. "Doctor, we'll be following up on this with the hospital administration. This can't happen again, not to anyone." Dr. Grant left the room quietly, knowing his actions would likely face further scrutiny. As Aisha rested, Marcus leaned in close. "You did it, babe. You stood your ground, and now he'll think twice before brushing off anyone else." She smiled weakly. "I didn't want to fight tonight. I just wanted to be heard." "And you were," he said, squeezing her hand, loud and clear. In the days that followed, Aisha's story made its way to the hospital board, thanks to a detailed letter Marcus sent on her behalf. Dr. Grant was placed under review, and the hospital launched new training programs focused on recognizing and addressing biases in patient care. For Aisha, the experience was exhausting, but it reminded her of her own resilience. She didn't seek revenge, she sought change, and by speaking up, she had done just that. Sometimes the biggest victories don't come from grand gestures, but from simply refusing to stay silent. And as Aisha recovered, she knew her story had made a difference, not just for herself, but for anyone who might one day find themselves in her shoes.